In the wake of Hillary Clinton's failed presidential bid, Democratic Party officials have only really managed to do two things. One is to blame everyone except themselves for their defeat, and the other thing is to look for candidates who are not named Bernie Sanders as their potential 2020 nominee. And in the summer of 2017, they were making a strong push for Kamala Harris, the junior senator from California. While they're not pushing her quite as hard at the moment, I think that there's still a lot of reason to believe that the establishment will push very hard for Kamala Harris when the primary cycle begins around next year or so. So, before we get to that juncture, I would like to expose a lot of the arguments that people make in favor of Kamala Harris and show that, in fact, she is not someone who would appeal to progressives, and that her perceived strength is purely on paper, and that she, in fact, is not a formidable candidate either in a Democratic primary or in a general election. So, without any further ado, let's go into Kamala Harris's background and then look at her electoral prospects. So, who is Kamala Harris? Why does she matter? And why is she qualified to be president? Well, prior to her election to the Senate in 2016, Harris served as California's Attorney General under Governor Jerry Brown. As Attorney General, she inherited the problems of the subprime mortgage crisis and also the normal problems that any Attorney General has, such as overseeing criminal prosecutions across the state. As AG, she had a mixed but mostly positive tenure. However, despite the fact that there were some bumps along the road that we'll talk about, the kind of fame that she received from her deeds was much greater than what she most likely deserved. Her main accomplishment as AG was to increase relief to victims of the subprime mortgage crisis and to impose stiffer penalties on banks than what President Obama was pushing for. And that actually is a pretty big accomplishment, in all fairness to Senator Harris. And because of these achievements and then her subsequent election to the United States Senate, she was then picked up and promoted by the establishment media as a superstar in the Trump era and as one of the faces of the so-called resistance. So who is supporting Kamala Harris and why? The people who are pushing for Kamala Harris the hardest, by far, are the neoliberal establishment leaders of the Democratic Party, who, despite presiding over years of failure, are still firmly entrenched. They think that Kamala Harris is a universally acceptable candidate who checks all the boxes for all the people, or at least all the people that matter from an establishment perspective, namely the donors and the party leaders. They also think that as someone who is half Jamaican and half Indian, that Kamala Harris is the perfect identity politics candidate. So she would combine the racial minority status of Obama with the femaleness of Hillary Clinton. In other words, she would be a juggernaut of identity politics power. The problem is, of course, leaving aside the fact that identity politics power is not a real thing, that she is highly unlikely to be able to appeal to progressives, unions, or the working class due to her lack of interest in their issues, and also her background, which we'll get into. And this will be a major stumbling block for her in both the primary and the general elections. So now let's get into the problematic aspects of Kamala Harris's background and her record. Within hours of articles coming out in the mainstream press about how great Kamala Harris is and how she'd make a fantastic presidential candidate, the left responded, and they pointed to the biggest failure of Kamala Harris's political career when, as a California Attorney General, she did not prosecute Steve Mnuchin and his One West Bank in 2013. Now, she claimed that the evidence for securing a prosecution was insufficient, and it appears that this is a fairly debatable thing. Many people think that there was sufficient evidence to go after Mnuchin. In 2016, Steve Mnuchin seemed to have appreciated Kamala Harris's decision because he actually donated $2,000 to her Senate bid. And that is interesting because Steve Mnuchin is a hardcore Republican, and she's the only Democrat to have received a donation from him. Overall, though, as California AG, there was a time when she did press Obama to be tougher on the banks, and she increased the size of the settlements to victims of the subprime mortgage crisis. And here is a picture of Steve Mnuchin and his wife looking like Bond supervillains holding up a bunch of cash. Of course, Steve Mnuchin is now the Secretary of the Treasury, and there was a recent news item that he apparently does not understand the Constitution or American law because he doesn't get that the line item veto was ruled unconstitutional during the Clinton administration. But he's saying that Congress should just allow the president to do it anyway and set some sort of rule to give Trump a superpower that allows him to simply go through the budget line by line and do what he wants. So yeah, had Kamala Harris gone after Steve Mnuchin back then, we wouldn't have him as Secretary of the Treasury now, and there's no telling how much damage he'll do in office. He is one of the biggest criminals in an administration that's really just full of idiots and criminals. The combination of Kamala Harris's inexperience and also the fact that in her limited experience she's already managed to raise several red flags, some of which we'll talk about going forward, it isn't really all that clear why the establishment is backing her, unless you understand that their model of politics is fundamentally a combination of an underlying neoliberal philosophy camouflaged with the rhetoric of identity politics. And Kamala Harris is the most appealing and most fully realized face of identity politics that you can imagine. Her parents, respectively, are Indian and Jamaican. So she is mixed race, and neither of those races is white. She's also female. Now, another typical trait of the establishment Democrats is that they tend to be people from wealthy families who don't have any interest in class issues and have no class consciousness whatsoever because they're from the elite. So for them, class is very much an afterthought. The only struggles that they're interested in are struggles of gender and race. So Kamala Harris comes from a pretty well-to-do background. Her mother is a cancer researcher and her father is an economics professor. That is a very privileged background. Now, some people say, well, she can't really be privileged because she's a mixed-race woman. Her parents, or at least one of them, was an immigrant, etc., etc. But no, if both your parents are professors and you grew up wealthy, you are a privileged person, period, the end. Also, given how academically accomplished her parents are, Kamala Harris must have seemed like a massive disappointment from an academic standpoint. So she went to Howard University, which is a historically black college and not really all that prestigious, and then she earned her law degree from UC Hastings College of Law, which is ranked 50 overall, but is number 1 in diversity. If you are someone in the establishment looking at this, the fact that she attended these schools where she most likely was able to get something like a minority scholarship despite being rich, this really sends up another couple of red flags. Because it means that despite coming from an extremely privileged background where both parents are very bright and very accomplished, Kamala was not really able to live up to what they did. And she might have gotten minority scholarships rather than having her parents pay for it, which would mean that she may have been taking opportunities away from people who suffer from actual societal disadvantages. Also, if you look at how the right would be likely to attack her in a general election, there's no way that they'd let these things pass. They would definitely paint her as a token attorney general and a token attorney. Also, she failed her bar exam the first time, which is not all that unusual, but because of how her background is with her parents both being professors, and then the fact that she's not from the greatest law school, this would all be made to paint her in a way that makes her seem dumb. So, while this might not be an inherently bad background, this is something that the right will attack her on. Guaranteed. Another thing she has going for her is that the establishment likes to have, if possible, young and reasonably attractive candidates, and Kamala Harris is only in her early 50s and she's a reasonably attractive person. So she has those things going for her. Generally speaking, if you want to, put a good spin on your policies, it's good to have a friendly face, which is reasonably pleasant to look at. So that's another thing that she has going in her favor for the establishment, but it's something that it seems like voters are starting to figure out is irrelevant, as witnessed by the fact that Bernie Sanders got quite a bit of support. So now let's move into the things which will prevent Kamala Harris from really being able to win the nomination or a general election. I think one major problem that a lot of people haven't realized is that Kamala Harris will suffer from her high profile and she is overexposed. Aside from Joe Biden, she's the candidate who the establishment media has chosen to lavish the most attention upon. But she's not ready for prime time, she's still inexperienced, and she is likely to shoot herself in the foot or to not deliver if people have high expectations of her. So I don't think that she'll be able to live up to the expectations of having a high profile in politics. In 2015, as Attorney General, she did something else, which, if revealed, would be embarrassing. And by the way, when I say if revealed, I found this on Wikipedia, so it's not exactly hard to find. But it's not something that people have been talking about. However, it definitely would come up if she continues to be a contender. There was a California inmate trying to get a gender reassignment surgery, and Kamala Harris went through several processes of appeals to try to get this procedure stopped. Now, the problem with this, and I don't really know the legal details of what was happening or why Kamala Harris opposed this person's gender reassignment surgery, but since she will have to run an identity politics centered campaign, which will include being a huge champion of gay rights and the LGBTQ community in general, this will not play well. And this will really undermine her message of social liberalism. Now, imagine in 2015 she had no idea that people were going to, anoint her as the next Democratic torchbearer. But the thing is, it's the age of the internet, and everything you do in public life can and will be used against you. Another problem that she has, and that her overexposure will really reveal, is that she is too similar to Kirsten Gillibrand, except that Kirsten Gillibrand is actually better than her in everything except for diversity. Kirsten Gillibrand is very white, as you can see from that picture, but otherwise she's more qualified, more experienced, and has far better political instincts. Cory Booker, at this point, his political strategy is just to wait to see what Kirsten does and then sign on to it. And I think Kamala Harris, at this point, that might be her best strategy too. Just do everything Kirsten Gillibrand does and hope that she gets credit for it. Despite the fact that Kamala Harris is a United States Senator, she has never actually participated in a meaningful election. Let me explain. So, in 2016, the California Senate race was more or less a coronation for Kamala Harris. In the primary, she faced Blue Dog Democrat Loretta Sanchez, and Loretta didn't really actively campaign, so that was a pretty easy victory. Then in the general election, no Republican ran, and she faced Loretta Sanchez running as sort of like an independent or something. And again, Loretta Sanchez didn't really campaign that hard, and it was more or less a cakewalk. And despite the fact that she has never really faced any meaningful opposition and that she's been running in a deep blue, safe state, she still managed to raise over $17.6 million in the last 5 years, despite the fact that she's faced no opposition. Normally, you need an actual opponent to raise that kind of money. So this means that because she's getting this kind of cash, that it must be the case that people think that if they give her money, she will deliver results for them. So let's look at who gives her money. Her top donor is Time Warner Cable. Have you ever met a single person outside of people who have stock in Time Warner Cable who actually like TWC or Spectrum or whatever they're calling themselves these days. Looking at her top 5 industries, her number 1 industry are lawyers, and number 5 is finance. So that points to her having some fairly conservative political leanings. And her number 2 industry is Hollywood, which means that in a national election, she will be smeared as a Hollywood elite and someone who cavorts with movie stars and all of that normal stuff that Republicans like to say about Democrats, except in this case, it will basically be true. Her husband is a partner with Venable LLP, which is a law firm that has a pretty mixed track record when it comes to where they stand politically. On the one hand, they have successfully represented for orphans and gotten them better care from the state. On the other hand, though, they've also represented oil companies trying to resist Obama-era offshore drilling moratoriums. So this is sort of a fairly good representation of what neoliberalism is. Sometimes neoliberals will stand up for things, or they will sometimes do things for kids, like CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, or what Venable did for the orphans in California. But on the other hand, at a fundamental level, they are there for corporate interest. They will defend the right of oil companies or big tech companies to do what they want and to derive benefits from the state. So just looking at where she gets her money from and the fact that she's never actually won a real election, these are both troubling things for different reasons, and I think that they should really be reasons for people to vote against her in the Democratic primary. Now I'd like to take a look at 3 seemingly unconnected things and then connect them and show you that Kamala Harris is fundamentally an incompetent candidate. So, as Attorney General, Harris 3 times defended county prosecutors who were engaging in illicit practices. For example, in one case, there was a county prosecutor who was inserting false confessions into a transcript, got caught, it went to court, and then Kamala Harris went and defended this prosecutor despite the fact that the evidence was clear. There were 2 other instances that were not far off from that, and these things made the news. So if Kamala Harris does rise to prominence as a presidential candidate, there's no way that these things will go unreported, both by her primary opponents and by the Republicans. So that will be a major millstone around her neck. This is a reasonably big scandal were it to come out. If we look at her political instincts, she is someone who does not understand that single-payer health care is extremely popular and that the people are all but demanding it at this point. So at one point when she was asked, she decided to hedge her bets somewhere between the establishment and the progressive wing, and she said that she was in favor of the concept of single-payer, which of course is a completely meaningless statement. And then later on, she finally got on board with Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill and that general plan. But she only did so after Elizabeth Warren, who is an actual progressive, and then Kirsten Gillibrand, who has good political instincts, got on board. And then Kamala Harris took the temperature in the room and realized that actually this was what the Democrats needed to do. So she jumped on, and then Cory Booker, who is also politically inept, also eventually signed on, but for both of them it took quite a while. Currently, she also is someone who's taking a long time to figure out that the issues that Bernie is highlighting are the ones that Democratic voters and the American people as a whole are interested in. So Bernie right now is trying to battle against the U.S. intervention in Yemen and the U.S. support for Saudi Arabia in particular, which is allowing for what is essentially the genocide in Yemen. And Bernie is also pushing to have Congress's authority over war and deployment restored. The Presidential War Powers Act from the 1960s gave the president the ability to more or less unilaterally make war without any kind of declaration, and Bernie's trying to roll those powers back. Well, Kamala Harris is a part of this fight, but she is a backbencher. She's not out in front, whereas in one article on it, Gillibrand got her name mentioned as one of the major supporters, even though she was not one of the bill's sponsors. So again, there's a big difference in potential establishment candidates between Kamala Harris and Kirsten Gillibrand. Gillibrand knows how to play the game, and she knows how to feel the wind. Kamala Harris is a bit clueless. She's still inexperienced, and she, for that reason, will most likely not be a very formidable contender. All things considered, I really don't see Kamala Harris as being a major contender. I see her as, at best, a mid-level contender for the Democratic nomination. She's not even the strongest establishment Democrat, and the problem with being an establishment Democrat in 2020 is that they will be playing to a part of the base which is quite a bit smaller and less energized than the progressive wing of the party. So, although the establishment candidate will be able to count on the full support of the party apparatus, you still have to win votes legitimately, and if you can't do that, you will not be able to win, even with some degree of rigging. Another problem for Kamala Harris is that she is not a savvy or experienced politician. And as I mentioned above, she also has some major liabilities if you look at her record. She does have very strong support from donors, but there's someone else who's an establishment Democrat, and that person is from New York, where Wall Street is, the biggest donors of all. So I really can't see Kamala Harris being the only person who will have bags of money coming into this process. And since she will probably not be very effective at using that money, I don't think that it will avail her much. So, given her dubious political judgment, I think that combined with the fact that she has unproven electability will be fatal. Again, like Hillary Clinton was largely selected for the primary because people thought she was electable. I know several people who voted for Clinton over Sanders on the understanding that she would be more viable in a general election, a stance which pretty much all of them now regret. And that was what Hillary was pushed on in 2016. And if the establishment tries to push that narrative about Harris, it will ring hollow, because the only races that she's run are against nominal opposition at best. The other problem for her is that, as I mentioned, progressives are now the strongest faction within the party in terms of the voting base, and they have been skeptical from day one. No one is buying that Kamala Harris is actually progressive, or that she will be an agent for change. My prediction is that she will be the Jeb Bush of the 2020 Democratic primary. She will have a lot of money, but still make no impact. If she survives the primary, it will only be because of electoral irregularities, like Bernie Sanders gets ill, and maybe Kirsten Gillibrand doesn't run, and Cory Booker breaks a leg and can't campaign for 3 weeks. It would require a lot of things to put her over the top. It would also require that there's no strong progressive, like Warren doesn't run, Gabbard either gets smeared or doesn't run. Like it would require a lot of things. I'm not saying it's impossible. Kamala Harris is a stronger candidate than, say, Tim Kaine or someone like that, but she is massively overrated by a whole lot of people, and I hope that I have created more realistic expectations for her. I don't think that she will end up being the nominee, and I really hope that she is not the nominee, because if we look at the weaknesses that she has, her inexperience, her bad political instincts, the fact that she can't motivate progressives, the fact that she will really struggle with working class voters, she probably will not know how to message because of her attachment to identity politics and neoliberalism, and all the things on her record from being AG that Republicans will really feast upon. Her background as someone who went to historically black schools despite being the daughter of 2 professors. She will be someone who, if nominated, could actually lose to Donald Trump. Now, I'm not saying that she would, or that even he would be favored against her, but she potentially could lose to one of the most beatable incumbent presidents in history. And even if she did win, she might cost us a number of seats down ballot in a year when the census is being taken, not something that we can afford. So, I urge you all, do not fall for Kamala Harris. She is not a progressive, and she also gives us no benefits as a Democratic contender.